out with a pack on my back to see the world, as I was told young men are supposed to do. I worked my way across the ocean on a freighter. I drifted east. Again, times were very different. The dollar was strong. There were places you could go then that you can't go now. And I ended up returning from months of walking around India and Nepal and Afghanistan and Pakistan through the Soviet Union. I wanted to see the Soviet Union, if only for a week. And thinking now, when we think about Russia, we all think one thing. Terrible leader, this horrible war. But I grew up with the people I knew, among the people I knew best, my family, Russian Americans, who I love. And now, it's a different time. But I traveled through the Soviet Union. I was happy that my parents have left when they did. And I am proud to be a Russian American, realizing now there is some Ukrainian in there too. So this is a personal talk, and at the same time, a very objective one. Part of the challenge we face on this story is that even among the world of UFO researchers, this is what we call a one-off. The scenario and the description of the beings is so different than any case that we had encountered before or have encountered since that the normal media ridicule factor, and let's remember, it's only the last few years that newspapers, television, national, international news reports, as well as our elected officials, are starting to take this damn subject seriously. But for most of its life, for the first 70 years, it was a big joke. Flying saucers and little green men, I don't have to tell you. And the field day the American media had with this story was over the top in great part because of the uniqueness of the descriptions. We're going to take a look at the event itself, but equally important, the way it was covered. And then a personal aspect, I connected up shortly after, within some months after the event, with a Russian professor of stress and metals who was a resident of the city in question and who was a crack UFO investigator. He and his team were on that location within hours. They wrote a book on it, and we became friends. This was the old days when you did it by mail, and that enriched the information I'm about to give you. That understood. That little spot to the left, that's the Ukraine. A peaceful democracy that was minding its own business for the past 30 years with its own history of hundreds of years that the current leader of Russia decided to invade. Thousands of people killed so far. God only knows how it's going to end up. But it's in good part about oil and grain power and this mystical idea that all these countries should be united under one single autocratic. This is a map of the old Soviet Union. Described by Ronald Reagan as an evil empire, and certainly its leadership, hardcore communists, in some ways were that. But let us always remember that the governments of nations do not necessarily represent the people who live there. I think we all know that. The May Day parade, always a legendary display of might under the old Soviets. The Russian army, of the shots, and we're all becoming fairly sophisticated about the media. It doesn't matter whether they're on the left or the right. We don't fully trust anybody, and you know what? That's the way it has to be. I sometimes tell people, especially entering the work of UFO studies, that if they had $1 million and a full laboratory and a team of assistants, their best research tools are still going to be deductive reasoning, common sense, and good old intuition. Pick and choose the information. We're hearing about the terrible carnage, the war crimes that are being committed. Not every Russian soldier is involved in them. At the same time, those who are should be prosecuted in the world court. But it really goes to the leader. Once again, this is not a conflict driven like World War I by different forces and different nations and different leaders. This is one man. It's just important to remember that most of the men we're seeing in these pictures are conscripts. You serve, you follow orders. I know we have a lot of veterans in here, maybe some serving military people. You're under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. You don't get to make your own decisions, as you know. Vladimir Putin, a power-hungry monster, masquerading as a statesman. Soviet Union has had quite an extraordinary bunch of leaders, many of them frightening to terrifying. The worst of them, Joseph Stalin, responsible for the murder of tens of millions of his own people. But when this event happened in 1989, there was a very different leader in the Soviet Union. So different that it ended with him. A lot of us, history teaches us, Ronald Reagan won the Cold War. Well, President Reagan presided over the end of the Cold War, but this is the man who ended it. Mikhail Gorbachev, a communist who realized that communism didn't work and felt things had to be set loose and return to their own level. He walked away from the Cold War. It was a confusing moment in world history. We always had this mutually assured destruction, America against Russia, and all of a sudden, the Soviet Union is in free fall, and it's Russia. This gives you a location. The city of Voronezh, a good-sized city, about 300 miles south, just southeast of Moscow, is where the events in question happened. This is a telex. You can't really read it here. It's special for me in that I received this personally from employees of TASS, the Soviet news agency, which at the time had its headquarters, as many major news agencies did, in Rockefeller Center. It was in New York. I lived fairly close. On the day these news stories started to come across the wire services and started to show up on television, I thought, wow, I wonder if I could get into their offices. I would have never even thought about it. But yet, history was changing, and things were in free fall. And I put on my best grown-up voice, called the number from the phone book. Hello, my name is Peter Robbins. I'm an investigative writer specializing in the subject of UFOs. I'm watching with interest on television as the story is unfolding in Voronezh. I wonder if I might drop by your offices and chat with your people. Thinking, right. And 40 minutes later, I was there, surrounded by this staff who were more excited to have me there than I was to be there. I was a UFO guy. And they left me with these wonderful telexes coming off of the ticker, and my involvement in the case began. So, this is the city park. On Monday, October 9th, 1989, the habitually pragmatic Soviet news agency TASS shocked many around the world with a news release stating that, quote, scientists have confirmed that an unidentified flying object recently landed in a park in the Russian city of Voronezh. They have also identified the landing site and found traces of aliens who made a short promenade around the park. Aliens visited the place after dark, at least 3 times, locals report. A large shining ball or disc was seen hovering above the park. It then landed, a hatch opened, and 2 or 3 aliens, creatures similar to humans, and a small robot came out. The story continued from there. More than 40 eyewitnesses stood by their accounts, and the Soviet government stood by TASS's report. This was unheard of. The Soviet government had never backed a UFO report in the entire history of the empire. Obsessive American news coverage followed, almost all of it dismissive, condescending, and kind of insulting to people's intelligence. A week later, the story was old news and relegated to the realm of myth, confabulation, and to some, fiction. Now, the New York Post, for New Yorkers, it's not the most intellectual newspaper. What they're most famous for people like me, is their outrageous headlines. I remember when I was young, there was a murder in the West 40s in an after-hours club, and whoever wrote the headline that day should have been given a promotion. It's still one of the most legendary headlines of all time in New York publishing. Headless body found in topless bar. Doesn't get much classier, right? Anyway, this was the way the Post covered it. Okay. Such examples of civic stability stand out in sharp contrast to the event of the alleged events to have taken place in the city park on Wednesday, September 27th. And in almost every aspect of this case was decidedly non-standard. And in this field, that's strange on top of strange. Nor does it help that most of the witnesses were children. School had just gotten out. They were in the park. Despite the credibility of the accounts of young people in such important cases as the African Zimbabwe school case, which is one, if you're not aware of, is one of our most important, and we're soon to see a major documentary coming out on that. These accounts were dismissed in part because, well, they're kids, and you know, kids. More, some of the specifics reported by the percentage of witnesses willing to put themselves on the line, and this is Soviet Russia. Maybe you don't want to attach yourself to a story like this. On the line were unique to the individual or to the group of witnesses and not another. And once again, location. Now, let's get a sense of the city of Voronezh. It's a combination of old-style Soviet utilitarian architecture and some beautiful 19th century Tsarist-era architecture. Postcards ubiquitous in the world of travel. In other words, with a few flourishes and touches, not that much different than some other cities in the world of European and East Europe. Particularly lovely shot there of Voronezh from a rather romantic angle in winter. So, the city park. And the first of a number of child witnesses. The children were more than willing to go on the record. There were news people there almost immediately. It started in the afternoon, it continued into the night. More of these young witnesses. So, the first UFO appeared at 6:30 p.m. as a red light descending toward the ground. The light then took on the appearance of a spherical or egg-shaped object and then circled the immediate area, agitating the grass from about 40 feet. It then flew off, only return a few minutes later and hover over the park. A door or hatch seemed to open on the lower half of the object, where a being could be observed. The UFO finally came to settle onto a poplar tree, causing the tree to bend under its weight. Children and adult witnesses have the diameter of the object ranging from 30 to 40 feet. The being observed in the hatchway was very tall, in excess of 10 feet tall by most accounts. It wore a silvery suit and had a very small head, not much more than a bump peeking above the garment. It then climbed out of the craft, climbed down the tree, as did a small, squarish, robot-like entity or entities, depending on the account. A luminous rectangle appeared under them when they stepped onto the ground. It disappeared when the taller being made a sound. The being touched some knobs on the robot's chest, and the two began to move. It received immediate press and broadcast coverage all over the Soviet Union. Now, what we're going to see here are a number of Soviet artist descriptions that appeared in various Russian publications within the first few days of these beings. And I think you can already see how different these humanoid type beings and this little box-like, I guess, their version of R2-D2, are from any other case that we've ever had in the history of UFO studies. The drawings to the right are some of the children's drawings of what they observed. Well, these drawings. Another compilation of the images. Now, as we're going to learn at a certain point, these beings walking, moving through the park. And the press release used the word promenading. It's an old-fashioned word. It's kind of arcane. Nobody uses it now for walking. But as you'll see in some of the American television coverage, they stress the word and make fun of the word. While this was happening, a young boy reacted with fear. And one of the beings, as we'll find out, turned an object on the boy, and he disappeared. Multiply witnessed, he simply disappeared. I'm relieved to report that the object was aimed later in another spot, and he reappeared. This is what the witness testimony was. Another artist depiction. And remember here, you're an artist working for the media. You either follow the descriptions as well as you can. Like a police artist, you don't add your quirks to the sketch of an alleged perpetrator. You do it as well from the description as possible. Here, in this next one, we see, I would say a liberty has been taken. Monster bodies here, but small heads rather than a little bump. Inaccurate, but interesting. And this other Soviet artist drawing depicting the head. So, attention to the incident served to galvanize ufologists all over the USSR, as well as among the public at large, and investigators commenced to study immediately. We're going to move forward here through some more descriptions of the craft, more descriptions from the newspapers of the beings, and here we come to a compilation of the coverage that this subject received in official state newspapers all over the country. Again, this was unprecedented. The Soviet press never made any serious statements in their entire history about the UFO phenomenon. Huge, full-page, massive coverage. And even with the serious coverage, at a certain point, even the Soviet press, how can you not want to have a little fun at the expense of something that sounds so over the top? So we don't have to read Russian to understand the universal language of humans longing to make contact. Or, in this case, it looks like alcohol is involved. Or in this case, the perfect way to get rid of aliens, I think we all have a spray can of this under our bed, correct? Now, Yuri Lizotsev was among the first people on the scene. Yuri is the co-founder of the Vodanos Joint Anomalous Phenomena Research Committee, a non-profit organization not associated with the government, dedicated to the study of the unexplained. Yuri and his co-authors, Lizotsev is a structural engineer and an associate professor of mechanics who was teaching at a nearby technical institute in September of 1989 when the event happened. He had been a serious UFO investigator since 1976 and arrived at the park accompanied by fellow members of the research committee shortly after the events transpired. The investigating team worked intently on location and continued to interview witnesses and collect and classify data and evidence for more than a year. They inspected the area beneath the poplar tree and the tree itself, centimeter by centimeter, finding several ground impressions in close proximity. They were approximately 15 centimeters in diameter deep and 5 centimeters, well, 15 to 5 centimeters deep. As these reports are first starting to come across American television, I'm sitting in my living room on West 57th Street in New York. I'm working on an early chapter draft of a book that took some years to write. And this is the old VHS days. Some of you may remember that technology. I always had a blank tape sitting waiting to go. Who knows, maybe a movie would come on I'd want to see later, what have you. Some people listen to music while they work. I was listening to the news. And all of a sudden, here's this UFO report. I slammed that tape in. And for the next days and weeks, I had it ready to go as more coverage came up. What we're about to see is an approximately 3+ minutes compilation of the very first coverage of the first day or two of the event. It's fragmented, of course. Only one newsreader, I remember, I think she was with Fox, but I'm not sure, did a serious job and did her best to just be professional and report it like any other story. What I want you to pay attention to here is not just the content, but how quickly it degenerates into a wink wink, nudge nudge. I'm just reading the news, folks. I don't believe this stuff any more than you do, and having fun with it. And then the pseudoscientific explanations, then the kind of sophisticated dismisses, and a certain amount of what I can only call media meanness. We don't care if it's true or not. It's a joke as far as we're concerned, and we will signal you every nonverbal way that we can that we don't take this seriously.
To Moscow on 3 occasions.
We have to get rid of that image and then turn it down. How do we switch to how do we temporarily disable the images?
The report says as many as 3 aliens and a robot came out of a large shining ball or disc and took a stroll around the park. No clue if the alleged...
Because TASS, the Soviet news agency, tells us that an alien spaceship has landed in the Soviet Union. Now, they didn't used to talk about airplane crashes, much less alien invasions. Anyway, TASS says the spaceship landed in a park in Voronezh, about 300 miles from Moscow, that it was a large, shining ball, and the 3 creatures came out of the ship and walked around the park for a while. They say the creatures look more or less human, 9 to 12 feet tall with tiny heads. Chances are the Soviets will try to make propaganda out of this and say that when creatures 12 feet tall emigrate from outer space, they come first to the Soviet Union. Not true. Everyone knows we've had them here in the USA for years. That's our report for tonight. World News Tonight with Peter Jennings is next. Tonight,
the youngest UFO carrying giant human-like creatures with tiny heads recently landed in a Russian park. They walked around long enough to scare some onlookers and then disappeared.
Have reportedly spied some unusual activity. The official news agency TASS says that humanoids from outer space landed in the city and emerged from their spaceship for a promenade around the park. The beings are described as towering, about 12 feet, with tiny heads. The report says that Soviet scientists would vouch for the UFO landing. However, some observers note that with the new policy of openness in the Soviet Union, it is not unusual to see the headlines that compete with supermarket tabloids here in the West. Our writers and reporters are getting things ready for the next half hour.
Children. UFO experts in the United States say they're skeptical of the uncorroborated Soviet report. Colombian authorities are dealing with the aftermath of 10 bomb explosions.
The program's radio sent a reporter to interview one of the young boys who allegedly witnessed a landing and saw the alien. The boy says the creature opened a window on the flying saucer and peered down at him with 3 eyes, 2 in the normal place and 1 in the middle. He's saying the creature had no nose but just 2 nostrils for breathing. The television correspondent then interviewed 2 local UFO buffs who said they had checked the scene of the alleged landing with what they called a biodetector. That confirmed that living being had been on the spot, they said. Another fellow said a special magnetograph was used that showed a change of magnetic polarity in the area. The story from the southern Russian city broke on Monday when the official TASS news agency said UFOs had been spotted in the sky above Voronezh between September 23rd and 29th. The TASS correspondent who wrote the story, Vladimir Lebedev, said witnesses, mainly children, had spotted an alien with a tiny head, 3 eyes, and standing 12 feet tall, leave the UFO and take a walk in the park. The radio correspondent labeled the whole affair as hogwash. Lebedev said he sticks to his story. The Soviets have a strong bent for the occult, and recently Mikhail Gorbachev's loosening of the tight reins on the press has produced a flurry of such stories. UFOs, aliens, and even an abominable snowman stalking Siberia. And the latest craze is a psychic healer who appears on Soviet television in the morning.
This ordeal became an immediate bestseller, and he became something of a messiah to hundreds of followers nationwide. A jerk.
Not surprisingly, taking advantage of all the renewed interest in UFOs, the network feature we're about to start there was an attack not on Whitley Strieber per se, whose book had been out for 2 years, his famous book Communion, but a pitch to try to make him look like a cult leader. Got very ugly. Continuing on here, so I ended up calling the TASS news agency. I showed up there. The reporters I met were warm and welcoming and wished me good luck in my work and were pleased to hear me, as a so-called UFO investigator, take this case seriously. It must have been quite a time to be an employee of the Soviet media living in New York City as thousands of miles away the communist empire imploded on itself. Yuri Lazotsev and I met because he had written to the publisher of a scientific journal based in the works of a research scientist named Wilhelm Reich, whose interest was in how energy functions, asking for a complimentary copy of their publication and sending the publisher a copy of his and his colleague's book called UFOs in Voronezh. And she handed it over to me and said, you might want to contact this man. Well, this man, by the way, is Jacques Vallée, one of the most famous people in the world of UFO research, Dr. Vallée, who became so interested in the case that he then visited the Soviet Union to see the site for himself, declared it very real, and was very interested in following it from that point on. Okay, schematics of the location, some of the scientific data generated in terms of statistics, the book, UFOs in Voronezh. Well, again, if it had been a year or two earlier, I don't even know if I would have attempted to write. You knew your mail was going to get opened. That was the way it was between America and the Soviets. But it was 1989, and everything was falling apart. And I wrote to him, and he wrote back to me. And I wrote to him, and he wrote back to me. And by the third letter, we realized, because mail was all there was at the time, we weren't going to be making long-distance calls, and this thing called the internet was not even somebody's dream quite yet. But by the third letter, we realized we're not going to get messed with. And then we really began in earnest exchanging data on cases, statistics. We became friends. We exchanged holiday gifts. We learned about each other's families. It's another edition of the book. Another artist depiction of the landed craft. Now, coming into some of this coverage here, still the Russian, the New York Times took a special interest in this case. I did a lot of research on the media and ridicule and how it turned out that saying that you saw something that you couldn't identify in the sky became kind of shorthand in the Western world from the summer of 1947 on for saying, hi, I'm crazy, or I'm seeking attention, or I'm looking to be famous, or I want to make a fool of you, instead of, gee, that's interesting, I wonder what it was too. It was brilliantly exercised and worked well on the American public until only about 5 years ago when it started to disassemble. Anyway, the coverage in the press that started in this country was massive. Again, the event happened in September of '89 in the Soviet Union, but TASS did not release the story until October. This is one of the original telexes that was given to me by the reporters and the people employed by TASS in their Rockefeller Center office. Now, for the New York Times to have a front page, full page article on the subject of UFOs is very rare. And their coverage actually started out fairly fair-minded. The news reporter suggested, well, that TASS itself took the story as something of a joke when really they didn't. And they contacted a UFO researcher with the National UFO Computer Network that no longer exists. His attitude was, I think TASS is exploring its new freedom, as one of the talking heads said, and it's not used to self-censorship. To say that this was the result of the Soviets, who have long lived under the yoke of communism, are now having this blast of press freedom, and of course are all deeply religious, mystical people, and this is just a manifestation of throwing stuff out there in terms of psychic phenomena, and we can expect it. It's just the way it is not surprising, but it is insulting because it's not the truth. This was the newspaper I grew up with, the big Long Island newspaper called Newsday. That first week, the press coverage was extraordinary. And then the New York Post again, and of course illustrated with a real picture from the real event. Give me a break. Now, this was very interesting to me. It's like the second or third day of the press coverage, and their reporter, who is a woman, Esther Fine, writes a very serious analytical article on the case. Somebody on the editorial board, I don't think, liked it, because Ms. Fine then disappeared off the pages of the Times, and the next day's article was written by somebody named Eleanor Blau, and the suggestion is, oh well, TASS is just having some fun. Well, that's kind of insulting too. Bizarre, and that legendary, I mean, really, you can't beat that for a headline. But it checks out. Then finally, after almost a week, the Times has an editorial. At this point, they've been having up to 2 or 3 reports a day. And what it says, in part, is they posed as fair and objective commentary. It discusses the unique aspects of the incident and contrasts them with the considerably more unnerving accounts of alien abduction reported in America. The Voronozh visitors, they maintain, should be made far more welcome than their U.S. counterparts. All they did was take a walk around in the park. Russians are stated to have a particular fondness for the supernatural, and Soviet editors lacking skeptical armor. Blah, blah, blah. But the final sentence in this editorial, for me, was one of the most masterful pieces of what I would call Orwellian doublespeak I've ever read in a major American paper. And let's see where it goes. And of course, I lose my place right at this moment.
I believe in you.
Okay. Now, these explanations miss the point. You know what? I think I have time to read the full editorial. TASS, the Soviet press agency, has reported the landing of an extraterrestrial vehicle in the Russian city of Voronozh. The creatures who emerged were 9 feet tall with little knobby heads and 3 eyes. They had a small robot in tow and went for a promenade about the park, the TASS reports. While some Americans have harbored reservations about TASS reports in past years, this one they can embrace with more enthusiasm. The United States has its own share of UFO watchers, but the extraterrestrials they describe have been decidedly uncouth. The aliens who visit Americans tend to kidnap their hosts, in some cases erasing from memory many of the salient details of an otherwise unforgettable experience. The Voronozh visitors, in welcoming contrast, were peaceable. They didn't interfere in current political arrangements. They didn't lecture, proselytize, or find fault with local mores. One can overlook their failure to seek an introduction to the mayor, behaving in a perfectly normal manner for sightseers on strange planets. They just walked around the park, leaving behind 2 pieces of deep red rock of a kind, according to a geologist, quoted in TASS, that cannot be found on Earth, end quote. There are any number of solemn explanations in TASS's remarkable report. Some argue that the long suppression of religion in the Soviet Union has given Russians a particular fondness for the supernatural. Others suggest that the Soviet reporters and editors have only recently begun to develop the skeptical armor that Western journalists acquire after being fooled a few dozen times. That may be may explain why even the hard-boiled government officials who oversee tasks found the Voronozh report sufficiently plausible to print. These explanations miss the point. If extraterrestrial visitors have come to land somewhere, why not in Voronozh? Skepticism can be taken too far. These very columns in 1920 poured scorn on the idea of a certain Robert Goddard, who was the father of American rocketry, that rockets could fly in the vacuum of space. Mr. Goddard, the editorial regretted, only seems to lack the knowledge ladled out daily in high schools. The final sentence: as sure as rockets can never fly in space, TASS has broken the story of the century. Now think about that. As sure as rockets have never flown in space, TASS has broken the story of the century. The English confounds itself, leaving us to wonder exactly, is this a play on words? Is this a joke? Are they admitting it's true? Are they, in any case, the New York Times? This is a copy of the Journal of Orgonomy being the study of energy and how it functions, that was sent to Professor Lizotsev, that resulted in our friendship. Once again, a copy of the book. This is one of the letters that I wrote to him, mailing back to me. Again, I got very used to receiving these large brown envelopes with lots of foreign stamps on them. One of my letters, and I would never put a political cartoon like this if I thought the mail was going to be open. The beings. Another shot of the beings in question. Some skepticism from the Soviets. I wonder these days what happened to my friend Yuri Lizotsev. I hope he's good. I hope he had children. They weren't drafted into the army. Like every sane and decent person, I hope that somebody stops this current monster in charge of the Russian people from this horrible war. And I'd like to leave you with a thought. When I got into this work years ago, my focus, like maybe yours or most people's, is what the hell is going on? Who are these beings? Where do they come from? What are their ships like? What do they run on? Where are their home planets? Do they come from other dimensions? What do they have for breakfast? I mean, every possible variation on the question. But I have to say, over the intervening years, my focus has shifted. I'm not nearly as interested in them as I used to be, as opposed to us. The impact of taking this subject seriously can change the world. Ronald Reagan said in 1987, addressing the 45th session of the General Assembly, and I'm paraphrasing here, I often wonder, what if we knew we were faced by a common threat? Wouldn't we then come together and see ourselves more as human beings, etc., and having more in common than we have separating us? And then very elegantly edging out of it by saying, but isn't there an invader among us already? Isn't ignorance, isn't war, isn't famine? And then went back to his prepared text. Sadly, government officials think of these things in terms of threats. President Reagan founded the Space Force, not the Space Peace Corps. You know, Armored Man has this attitude. They're all bad, we got to get ready to fight with new weapons, and oh boy, certain military presence is the idea of taking battles into space. Is this going to be fun or what? Well, as my friend Travis Walton has pointed out, if they wanted to completely subdue us, who's not saying that they may not be pulling strings we're not aware of, we'd all be walking around with little metal hats on our head, staring straight ahead, working in the salt mines. My being here in a primarily Mexican and Mexican-American audience fills me with pride as a Russian American, as a New Yorker, and as a citizen of the world, that there are things that can bring us together. We're at such an interesting time where you have people as different as Marco Rubio, a representative of Republican right thinking, and one of my senators, Kirsten Gillibrand, a progressive and a smart woman with an extraordinary proposal. They're of one mind. They're thinking about the same subject. We need to know more about this. The fact that Tucker Carlson on Fox takes this subject very seriously, as does Wolf Blitzer on CNBC. These are hopeful things. This country has never been more fragmented, I think, since the Civil War, and the world's a mess, and we know it. If everybody started to understand that we have so much more in common than we have separating us, and that we're dealing with a myriad of other intelligences, we have a hope, I think, of coming more together than any other subject could bring us. And I hope that that continues to happen. I want to thank the city again, all of you for being here today, the wonderful volunteers. Thank you.
Peter, we're so appreciative of you coming all the way from New York, enduring those long plane flights. You said 3 of them. And we really, really want to thank you again.
My pleasure, my friend.
Peter and I once had the distinct privilege of both being kicked out of the Roswell UFO Museum. So we bonded back in 2007, I think, the first time. And we were remembering that he put on a heck of a Roswell UFO festival that year. He was working with the city in 2007. And he arranged for the Jefferson Starship to play in the small auditorium, a lot like this one, there in Roswell, which they put on a monster concert for those of us oldies. Their rendition of White Rabbit was just to die for. And anyway, it's good reconnecting with you, Peter, and thank you for coming down.
Thanks a lot, Peter. I too met you in Roswell several years ago, and just to see how this event has pulled everyone together is really an interesting process from different backgrounds. I don't know who else may have, but I think I might be the only one who's met, before today or this event, met Noe, Ken, Peter, Christopher, and Mike. And some of the other guests that have come here. Who else has met all of these different guests today? Anyone? I might be the only person. That's interesting. So, we've got a great program to continue on with. I'm going to share a little bit more about the Aurora incident that we had talked about a little bit earlier. I think we're going to see if we can get that switched over on the screen here.